We have here David Mowat, the Conservative MP for Warrington South, Paul Monaghan, Dr. Paul Monaghan from Caithness, Sunderland, and Easter Ross from the SNP. Take a seat on these three chairs. And Jamie Reid, who is Labour Member of Parliament for Copeland. Do take a seat.
Yep.
There. Grand. Thanks very much for coming in. We're going to just kick this around a little bit. Some fascinating food for thought from our scientific advisor there. But we've also heard this morning, obviously only a couple of weeks since Amber Rudd's energy policy was identified. Let's just go around, first of all, just to see your sort of starting position. So, David Mowat, the Conservative Party is pretty committed. Where are you on all this?
Well, I'm towards the committed end of the Conservative Party. It's worth remembering, though, for the group, that 7 years ago I became a candidate for the first time in Warrington. And at that time I went to a meeting of the Conservative Party, at which time our policy was not to have nuclear power as part of the mix unless it was a last resort. And it's worth just remembering how far it's come since then. I mean, the last spending review, there was, broadly speaking, no cuts to the NDA, and we've kicked off a programme of research into small modular reactors. That's a lot of progress. And the reason, and I think the industry is poor at this, the reason is that there is no possibility of the world meeting its climate change objectives, when you look at the numbers, without nuclear power playing a big part of it. There isn't any. And we can talk about Austria.
Politically, do you think your party is more driven by the need to keep the lights on, the need to create some great jobs in the UK, or the need to meet greenhouse gas emission targets?
I mean, it depends who you ask, but it's extremely handy, the point. I mean, it's not a very sexy argument to talk about base load, in all fairness. And
in this room, you can go
in this room it might be. Whereas what does work, and I think the industry doesn't do it enough, is to talk about the fact that 33% of Europe's electricity currently comes from nuclear. It's just not conceivable that we could replace all the transport stuff that we've just heard about and all the rest of it and the extra electricity that we're going to need without nuclear power being part of that. So if we do accept the climate change arguments, which at least on a precautionary basis, as we heard earlier, if we do accept that, there is nowhere else to go. And eventually, when you're right, the world comes with you.
OK. Dr. Paul Monaghan, the SNP's historically not so keen on nuclear power. Where are you on all this? You're on the committee, the all-party committee, and you're quite involved. What's your perspective?
Well, good morning. The SNP, as you just suggested, is not a big fan of nuclear power. The party's policies are to focus on renewable energy and develop innovative and creative solutions to climate change and towards meeting our power needs in the future.
Instead of, as well as? Nuclear?
Instead of, or as well as what?
Nuclear.
Instead of nuclear, yeah. I think our experience of nuclear focuses mainly on the problems that the waste issues generate and the long-term solutions towards that. And there are a lot of outstanding questions in relation to how we deal with nuclear waste. I think until they're resolved, I think we're sceptical of the need to use nuclear in a significant way.
Jamie Reid. You know all about this, you're very close to it. What's your perspective?
I think when we talk about the industry and when we go out of our way to maintain an effective political consensus about surrounding the industry, I always talk about, and I think it's useful to talk about, the 3 E's. So you will not find in politics generally anything like a magic bullet. But if you look at the nuclear industry, in a way it comes pretty close to being a magic bullet if we're talking about energy, the economy, and the environment. So if we're serious about our environmental objectives as a country, then we need nuclear baseload generation. There's no question about that. We just heard from Robin, it's a no-brainer. If we're serious about maintaining the security of our energy supplies, then nuclear is an absolute no-brainer. It's the critical element of a meaningful energy strategy. And if we're serious too about economic growth, and about the benefits that the industry can provide to our manufacturing sector, but also rebalancing the British economy away from the southeast towards more peripheral areas too. And then if we look at the effect that the industry has upon UK PLC GDP in the bottom line, then I really do see the nuclear industry as a 3-legged stool, those 3 legs being energy, the economy, and the environment. Now, I don't think that's an argument you can beat, frankly.
Is it an argument that's accepted by your new leadership?
I very much doubt it. The fact of the matter is, everybody will know that the British nuclear industry is a creation of the Labour Party, as is the independent British nuclear deterrent. And it's, I think, consistent with, let me get this right, is it straight talking or straightforward honest politics? I forget, but it's consistent with all of those sentiments that we have a shadow secretary of state who's exceptionally pro-nuclear, is as pro-nuclear as you would expect or want to be. And irrespective of the leader of the Labour Party's views on this industry, which haven't changed in 32 years, there remains, I think, and bearing in mind everything that has just been said from the SNP's perspective as well, which I think is legitimate. I disagree with it, but I think it's legitimate. There remains within Westminster, across the political spectrum, a very broad, deep, and I think reliable consensus about nuclear.
It's an important point because we heard from Vincent de Rivas from EDF this morning. This is an incredibly long-term industry. People in this room need no reminding of that. And to get investment, they need long-term certainty. Yeah. And so they need to know whether the House of Commons is going to change its mind, is going to go off all this investment and all this hard work. Do you think that's...
I don't think it's likely. Sorry, David.
First of all, I don't think it's likely, but B, in general, when minds have been changed, existing contracts have been honoured, and CFD contracts and all of the rest of it. So I really don't think that's the issue. I mean, Jamie's right, there is now more or less a consensus in favour of it. But I've been in debates, in Parliament, there's 20 people there, and I've been the only one talking about nuclear favourably. So it's worth remembering the consensus is quite shallow at times. And you see, renewables is a very sexy, again, to use that word, way forward. But the point is, when you look at the numbers, it's really, really difficult to see us getting there with renewables. And I don't think anybody in this room would be anti-renewable. It's just that the numbers don't do it in terms of what the world has to achieve if it's going to get anything close to the targets that they're talking about in Paris.
So let's talk a bit more about the SNP's concerns, because it's interesting, Dr. Monaghan, that in a way they mirror the public concerns we heard this morning, particularly around waste. And we heard that right at the beginning of the day, that the need to get the message out more as the industry sees it, to show what's being done on waste. I mean, you are the MP for Dounreay, aren't you? So you know what you're talking about. You have it in your patch. Do people who are familiar with it, do they have less concern or more concern for knowing what's going on?
The constituency that I have is Dounreay and HMS Vulcan. So together, on that site, there are 5 nuclear reactors. The NDA is currently building 4 enormous above-ground storage facilities for nuclear waste. The communities around those storage facilities are not happy with them. They're not content to live near nuclear waste, and they're worried about it. So there are significant concerns around nuclear waste, what we do with it. And there are issues at Dounreay in terms of, you might be familiar with the pit, the silo that they drilled into the ground a number of years ago, and what waste is in that. It's largely unknown. So there's a significant problem around that. Similar problems at Sellafield as well in terms of the silos that they have there. So waste is a huge issue. I think we've heard a little bit about the need to have long-term thinking here. I think from my perspective, the UK government's thinking in terms of energy solutions is remarkably short-term. We've just had the government reverse quite a lot of their policy on terms of encouraging renewable energy schemes. Carbon capture storage has just been taken a big hit as well. So one of the problems I have, and my party has, I think, is that the UK's strategy to meet the power needs of the people for the future is unclear. And there does seem to be a significant drift recently towards investing in very large scale projects that focus on nuclear. David's talked a little bit about small modular nuclear reactors that can go about, but that's really quite a new development. Remains to be seen what they will look like and what the problems might be around them. It will be an experiment.
And Jamie Reid, from your perspective as a pretty committed supporter of the industry, is that the concern that most people have? Where they have a concern, it's what happens to the waste. I mean, I have to say, as a reporter going out, the 2 concerns you hear, one is just the fact that it's a very large construction project, if you're talking about a new build, so noise, disruption, etc., which obviously the industry is working on. But the second is, what happens with the waste, which is a story we've heard some astonishing news about this morning, really, really positive stuff.
Well, it is a story which refuses to go away, and it is a concern that people have, and I think the concerns are broadly understandable, but I also think that they're also broadly misplaced. I think there's a challenge consistently for the industry to maintain a very close interface and dialogue with people and communities or other parts of civil society, NGOs or whomever, even politicians who are concerned about issues to do with radioactive waste management. Because the truth is we do have robust systems in place. We do have probably environmental and public protection standards which are the envy of the world, but we don't communicate that often enough or effectively enough.
I'm sure they're telling...
Can I just
yes,
come in on waste? Because I think waste is the Achilles heel of the industry and it isn't fixed. But I suppose my line on it is this, that the human race is capable of solving the waste issue, maybe in ways that aren't ideal, but it's capable of doing that. Whereas it's far from clear that the human race is capable of keeping our climate to within 2%, or even, frankly, even what they're going for now in Paris, they're calling it 2.7%. That's unlikely. It's far from clear that we can do that. So we have two problems, both of which are difficult ones. One, the waste problem, which is what nuclear hasn't fixed properly, wholly yet. And the other is this climate change issue, which it's not at all clear that the human race has got it within itself to deal with. And I think we have to make choices. And I think that argument is one that this industry should be making more vigorously than it does.
Paul?
Yeah, I largely agree with David on that point. I think there are two problems here. What are we going to do with the waste? I don't really see significant investment into developing waste solutions, and I think we need to be looking at that much more effectively. David's point about, does the human race have the intellectual capacity to think about climate change for the future? I would say that it does, but again, we're not properly investing in that to address those issues and to address the climate
What's
issues.
interesting, you're, if you don't mind me saying so, a great case study for this industry, because what's often talked about with public attitudes is that a lot of times they're built on ignorance and people haven't got the time to pay attention and they haven't really seen what the NDA is doing and all this amazing work that's going on at Sellafield and the new investment. I'm guessing you do talk to the NDA since you're the MP for Dounreay and you have some interest in what's going on there, and yet you haven't changed your mind as a result of hearing what is happening.
I meet with the NDA quite frequently, absolutely. I've been to Vulcan, I've been to Dounreay, I've seen the facilities, I've talked to my constituents. Waste remains an issue.
Jamie?
So there's nothing scientific, there's nothing in terms of engineering, there's nothing in terms of project management which is stopping us from solving the waste problem. Our inability to solve this problem in the way in which I think most of us would like it to be solved, and which is undeniably international scientific best practice, is politics. It's politicians who keep dropping the ball on the waste issue. It's successive governments which have dropped the ball on the waste issue. I think an independent Scotland would have an incredible difficulty with the waste issue. But I think these aren't issues which are either scientific or engineering based. These are purely political. We know what the best practice is to deal with our higher level radioactive wastes is now. We know what we ought to be doing. We have come very, very close to solving the problem, and it's been political issues and I think cultural issues to do with the way within which the country is governed and the interface between national government and local government, which has prevented these issues from being resolved a long time before now.
Do you want to comment on that?
No, I mean, I'll just say what I said earlier, which is that the point that the industry needs to make and keep making is it does produce stuff that lasts for hundreds of thousands of years. There are ways to contain it, and the human race is capable of fixing that. But the issue that we're not capable of fixing, what doesn't appear that we are, is the one of climate change, and the nuclear industry is centre of giving an opportunity for that to happen, leaving aside the other benefits of reliable electricity and all of that stuff.
The other thing people raise, David, is cost.
Yes.
What do you think about the price of the latest new generation that's coming in?
Well, I mean, we only know the price of Hinkley Point C. We don't. I mean, we hope, without prejudice to the sponsors of the conference, that the strike price for future stations will be lower. It struck me as being at the high end of expectations, but it's a consequence, in part, of the government getting itself into a position of wanting to do something and having one supplier able to provide it, at least at that time, it seemed to me, and A, that happened, and B, the CFD structure of paying for nuclear power stations, which basically means all the financing cost is paid for by the private sector in this case, is quite an expensive way of doing it. And that was a consequence of the way we got to the green light on nuclear within the coalition, or at the time the Liberal Democrats in particular, being very keen to be able to say there was no subsidy. And then it became no subsidy vis-à-vis other sources of carbon-free, which is where it broadly ended up. But I think there's an argument for saying that emerged and evolved into a strike price mechanism wouldn't necessarily be the way that you'd want to build a new generation of nuclear power stations if you had a blank piece of paper and could think it all through properly from scratch. But we are where we are, and what matters to me now is that we have something like activity on 6 stations in the UK, and that's a lot better than we've been for a large number of years.
And Jamie, if I ask you that question about support from the point of view of price rather than the general concept of nuclear, would it change your answer? Are Labour MPs less supportive? Because you've obviously, with Ed Miliband's price freeze, you've been making a lot of running on the cost of energy overall. This is of itself straightforwardly going to be expensive, defended for all sorts of reasons. But how do your colleagues feel about it?
It doesn't change their view. So I think the issue of price is a critically important issue. It's a critically important issue for consumers. There's no two ways about that. Again, the industry and advocates for the industry need to be consistent in making the case that actually decommissioning costs and waste management and disposal costs are factored into the strike price and the price of nuclear generation in a way which, frankly, fossil fuels are not. So if we were going to talk about the price of energy in this country, and I think we should always talk about that, I don't think it's a debate that anybody should resile from at any point. I think we need to talk about it holistically. I think we need to talk about the huge subsidies which go into renewables, which incidentally I support. I don't think it's a either-or solution we need towards climate change. It's a whatever we can get solution towards climate change. And there's a very strong argument to be made, but it's made in a reticent way, if at all, which frankly, the cost to the taxpayer, not just nationally, but globally in the fight against climate change, I think you can logically say constitutes perhaps the biggest subsidy to any electricity generating form there's ever been, in the form of essentially a retrofitted cost for fossil fuels. So let's be absolutely clear about the holistic costs of energy production. And I think when you consider those, nuclear is actually not only exceptionally responsible, but very favourable as well.
So, back in Scotland, could the SNP block the development of a new nuclear power station if one was suggested in Dounreay or anywhere else, or is it a UK government thing?
I think the policy of energy is clearly UK government. I think the Scottish government could block a new nuclear power station through planning laws, as we have done with fracking and unconventional oil extraction onshore already.
I mean, there's nothing on the table at the moment, but do you think they would, your party would exercise that option if it came to it? Is a new nuclear power station a bit of a red line for the SNP at the moment?
I suspect it would be. I haven't discussed it with Nicola Sturgeon, but I suspect, yes, that if there were proposals coming forward for a new nuclear power station in Scotland, I think the Scottish Government would probably have significant questions to ask and would probably block.
So your party's happy to see 20% of the UK's electricity just quietly switch itself off and replace the whole lot with wind and hydro?
No, on the contrary, I think we would like to see many more power generation schemes developed in Scotland. Part of the problem is that no power generation scheme in Scotland is viable at the moment because generators have to pay a surcharge to the UK government. That's significant and it's unfair.
Okay, I've got time for a couple of questions from the audience if anybody wants to pitch in on this. It's a very interesting political situation. I can just about see any hands going up. There's one up at the front here. Yeah, it's a chap here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Roger Murray again, Fuel Cycle Week. Just on the waste issue, I'm a bit lost as to what is now actually happening, because there was this failed consultation process in Mr. Reid's area, Cumbria, and it seemed to be left that there were hopes of perhaps overturning that, and there was a very vocal campaign against the situation of a deep geological depository, which is what we're all talking about, presumably, in Cumbria by certain local groups. But where are we now? Because I think that is, everyone I know says the waste issue is the issue. And when is it going to be resolved and how?
So
that's a quick question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to recognise there was an exceptionally strong pro case in my community for going ahead. And what I alluded towards earlier with the disconnection between central government and local government is what eventually was the undoing of this project. So for any meaningful progress to be made, there has to be a structural change in the attitudes of between DEC and local government in Cumbria. But the government's made it absolutely clear that there's a new process in place, that Cumbria is not a preferred or specially selected area. It's a genuinely new nationwide process. Clearly this will take a lot of time, but that is where we are. Would it be wise to speed that up? Probably not. But this is something which, personally, as somebody who, father of 4 children, lives in the Sellafield area, 3rd generation Sellafield worker, it's something I'm determined to see resolved within my lifetime.
Thank you. Any others out there? You've answered everything. How about that? In which case, we'll move on to our next session. But for the time being, ladies and gentlemen, would you thank our 3 guests, David Mowat, Paul Monaghan, and Jamie Reid. Thank you.